Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good early morning. I do appreciate that you had to arrive a bit earlier today than yesterday, but I think that the price you have to pay is worth it, because what is awaiting us is one of the highlights, or the highlight, of our Prague European Summit this year. The keynote speech given by the Vice President of the European Commission, who really had to squeeze in our conference in his very tight schedule, and we all appreciate that. I think there is no need for a long introduction from my side. I'll just very briefly say that Mr. First Vice President is responsible for a relatively wide portfolio in the Commission, responsible for the better regulation, interinstitutional relations, which is of particular importance for us at this conference, the rule of law and the Charter of Fundamental Rights. Mr. Vice President worked before as both Minister of Foreign Affairs and Minister of European Affairs of the Netherlands, and now for the last 2 years he has been working as the first Vice President of the Commission. So without further ado, Mr. Vice President, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and my apologies to those who had expected me here yesterday, but I had to go to the European Council to report on my visit to Turkey in the days before that. It is always a particular pleasure to be in Prague, which is, I think, one of the central places of our shared European history. Everything that went right, and especially everything that went wrong, took place in Prague in some way or form. Some of my favorite writers have Prague as the center of their universe. Mostly they wrote in German, but this is also a multilingual city through history. And especially now that I'll come to my speech in a moment, but I was thinking on the way here about one writer, a German writer, who was a fierce opponent of the Nazi regime, and who has written this epic book about the First World War, Nothing New from the Western Front, Remarque. He's also written a small book about the plight of refugees, German refugees who had fled the Nazi regime and were like ghosts in the whole of Europe, traveling from place to place, seeing where they could stay, choosing which country would be best for them. And he describes this very precisely, saying that in Austria the police beat you up and you only get to stay for a couple of days and then they kicked you out again. Whereas in Prague you can stay for a few months. If you are friendly with the police, they will give you a permit to stay for a few months and you can live a better life. So now I'm swimming across the river to go into the Czech Republic, Czechoslovakia, and I mean, if you read these books, this is about the 1930s, so many parallel elements come to mind about the plight of refugees today, some of whom flee the same brutal sort of regime as Remarque did and others did in 1930s Germany. So anyway, all this comes to mind when I'm in Prague. Perhaps I can use this first minute of my speech to encourage all of you who do not read to start reading, and especially read people like Roth and Remarque and Kafka, who will describe a world that is less far removed from our world than we sometimes think. Anyway, when we took office as Commission a year ago, we said that migration would be a challenge, but we didn't know that it would be a challenge at the level that we're facing now. We also know that this migration crisis comes at the back of other crises we had to face, and crises that have subsequently undermined our self-confidence as Europeans. I think I would start with the beginning of the terrorist attacks in the beginning of this millennium. After that, I think the reaction by the Western world to these terrorist attacks also undermined our self-confidence in the sense that we later came to a conclusion that what was done in Iraq perhaps wasn't the West's finest hour, to put it mildly, and it did undermine the confidence of our own people in our institutions and our political wisdom. And then we got the banking crisis, we got the economic crisis. Again, institutions were challenged, the trust in institutions went down. And in all this time, we had the terrorist threat all along Europe. We had to cope with other challenges as well, changes going on in our societies. And the migration crisis, the refugee crisis, is sort of the last element of what could turn out to be a perfect storm for European cooperation. And I want to say it in those clear terms because I am worried about the state of Europe, but I'm also worried about the future of our European project if we are not able to cope collectively with what is a collective challenge. The temptation on a national level to play into fears of people is great. It's great. It is, I think, a well-known psychological phenomenon that fear as a fuel for political rhetoric but also political activity is both very tempting and very dangerous. It is tempting because fear has the characteristic of going and looking for confirmation of its justification. So people who are afraid are mostly only open to facts or elements that confirm that they are right to be afraid. So you only see the correctness of your fear instead of elements that could dissuade you from being afraid. And for politicians, that is very tempting. People are afraid. They look for confirmation of their fear. Let's cater to that. Great fun. I'll be popular. And I think you see it in almost all member states of the European Union. The politicians who cater to that fear increase their popularity. But they can only do this free of charge because there are other politicians who take the responsibility seriously and try to find solutions. Because once everyone would give in to the temptation of fear politics, it would be the end of politics because policy would no longer be possible and it would be a Hobbesian confrontation in Europe as we have known in our past and we should not want to repeat. If there is one lesson we've learned in European integration in the last 60 years, it is that treaties, law, are a better alternative to power and imposition. So to replace a power struggle by a system based on the rule of law is fundamental to the way we want to continue our European construction. If we take that element out of it, we go back to, at best, a 19th century situation of a Europe of nations competing on the basis of economic and military power, and at worst, in a confrontational mode based on false ideological differences. And one of my concerns, worries, is that we believe too much that the European construction is indestructible. I'm not saying here today that it's going to be destroyed, but it's not indestructible. Nothing man has made is indestructible. Everything that is being made can also be undone. And the European project is no different. Any political construction can be undone. But I think the European construction merits being supported, being renewed, renovated, adapted where necessary, made more flexible if that is necessary. But it is essential for our common future. And I believe the biggest success of this European construction was the end of the European divide. But things happened so quickly. I mean, in history, of course, a quarter of a century is a blink of the eye, not more than that. And in a blink of the eye, what seemed unthinkable became reality, namely that there are no longer dividing lines, there are no longer iron curtains in Europe. I see many young people in this hall for whom the Cold War is history. For me, it's personal experience. I was trained as a soldier to fight the Warsaw Pact. I remember when I was a student in France in the mid-80s, that at a conference comparable to this, a French general said that he was very worried that one day Germany would be reunified and that then this Germany would essentially be neutral because NATO would not survive and this would be a great threat to Europe. And the Germans in the hall stood up as one man and said, the general is fantasizing, he's dreaming. There will be no German reunification. It's impossible. The world is as it is. Ladies and gentlemen, this was 1985. In history, what seems unthinkable before it happens is later portrayed by the same people as unavoidable once it did happen. And so that is why, with my personal experience in mind, I want to stay a strong advocate for the European project. Because what is unthinkable, if we are not careful, might become reality. We need to defend this project. And the first line of defense for this project today is the issue of refugees. I was talking about the greatest success of the project, which was European reunification, the end of the European divide. But it happened so quickly, and it was so far-reaching that our people on both sides of what was previously a dividing line sometimes did not get enough time to digest this, to understand what the consequences are. And so if today in the refugee crisis there are frictions and sometimes misunderstandings between East and West about how we provide solidarity in this crisis, part of this can be explained by the fact that we have different histories in the 20th century. And the difference in history defines also the difference in attitudes towards what is foreign, what is different, what is new. And there should be more understanding. It's no justification, I believe, to say we in Central Europe had a different history and therefore we cannot take refugees. That's not a justification. But it's not a justification either in the West to disregard the difference in history. If we understand each other better, if we do not lose the capacity to understand and respect historic differences in our developments, if we know that, we can come to terms with it and we can find solutions that everybody can support. I know for a fact, and I'm absolutely convinced about this, that if we go down the road of every man and woman for him or herself, in the refugee crisis, this will not just affect the way we deal with migration and refugees, it will have a profound influence on all the other elements of European cooperation. So fixing this is a prerequisite for fixing other problems we have in Europe. And can we fix this? Of course we can fix this. Not in the sense that we can put an end to migratory flows. Migration is part of the world today, is part of Europe today, will be part of Europe today, tomorrow, and the day after that. But what we can do is get this issue under control. That is entirely possible. What we need to do there is to clarify a few things. To act where we have neglected to act in the last couple of years. First and foremost, we need to make sure that Europe's external borders are better protected. That is of essential importance. And to do that, we need to create more European activity there. We cannot just leave that to those member states who happen to be on that border that now is used for people to come into Europe. So that is why the European Commission is in favor of a European Coast Guard. And I was at the European Council yesterday. I was encouraged by the fact that Robert Fico announced that Slovakia would contribute substantially more in terms of finances and people to our Frontex operation and EASO. This is what we need. We need to strengthen that. So it starts by a better protection of our external borders. If we neglect the protection of our external borders, member states will want to create more protection at the internal borders, and that will lead to a cascading effect that will, without any doubt, have serious consequences for Schengen and also for the internal market in the longer run. So protection of the external borders is one. Secondly, we need to work closer together with those countries that are now countries of transit before people arrive in the European Union. That is why I have been to Turkey now twice to see if we can strengthen the agreements we have with Turkey to challenge this issue jointly. It is absolutely clear that the European Union cannot solve, not manage this issue without Turkey. And it is equally clear that Turkey cannot manage this issue without the European Union. So we are in this together. And what we need to do is to make sure, for instance, that the way we treat visa in the EU and in Turkey is better aligned. So we need to make sure that we tackle the situation where people who can legally enter Turkey and then illegally cross to the European Union, that they are checked before they enter Turkey and that they can no longer legally enter Turkey. So we need to coordinate our visa policy, and we're working closely with the Turks on that to make that happen. We also need to make sure that we take away some of the push factors that are pushing people into the European Union because they are worried about where they are now in Turkey and Jordan and Lebanon and other countries. We need to make sure that we provide more support for people to be able to live decent lives in dignity in the camps or where they are in Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey. We need to make sure that we help those countries to afford these people the opportunity to work, to take up jobs. And one of the major elements we need to look at is to provide education for the children. That is of the greatest importance. If you talk to, incidentally, nobody talks enough to those refugees directly. Talk to them. It would be fascinating to talk to them. But if you talk to them, one of the most powerful push factors is, my kids have not gone to school for 2 years. I cannot afford for them to stay out of school another 2 years. So that's why I've come to Europe, because I want my kids to go to school. So why don't we as Europeans make sure they have schools there where they are now? That's what we need to be doing. That's what we need to be working on with Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan. So these are a few things we can do in this concrete matter. What we also need to do is, once people arrive, immediately fingerprint them and register them. Immediately. So that you can immediately distinguish those who have a right to asylum from those who don't have a right to asylum. Because it takes too long, and then people start exchanging stories, buying false passports, doing all sorts of things that makes it more and more difficult to distinguish those who have the right to asylum from those who don't. And I've been accused of being very tough on this, as far as people who don't have the right to asylum are concerned. But this is because if we are not tough on those who don't have the right to asylum, and if we are not more efficient in returning them from where they came from, the right to asylum will crumble for those who need it. That, to me, is crystal clear. The European public will no longer support an asylum policy that is unable to distinguish between those who have the right to asylum and those who don't. So we need to do a better job at that. We need to have better agreements with third countries that they take back their nationals who don't have the right to asylum. We need also to be clearer, because, many of these refugees are told by the smugglers not to cooperate, not to fingerprint, not to register, to say Germany, Germany, Germany and nothing else. I think we should also be clear with the refugees. If you don't fingerprint immediately, if you don't register, we assume you're not a refugee but a migrant and you will be sent back. We need to be tougher in these things. There is no alternative. I strongly believe in that. To save the system. Then I also believe an expression of solidarity across the European Union is necessary. The relocation mechanism is necessary in material terms, but is equally necessary in political terms. That member states say to each other, in a case that 1 or 2 or 3 member states are disproportionately burdened by this issue, solidarity will kick in and we will make sure that we solve this together. I think this is an essential element. Because at the end of the day, those who believe they can solve their problems by building fences and closing their borders can only do that because others are willing to solve the problems. Because if everyone goes down that road, it's the end of the Schengen system. And who will pay the price for that? Because if it's the end of the Schengen system, other systems will come to an end as well. The very core element of solidarity will be tested. And let me end on that, perhaps a more philosophical point before going to Q&A. And I apologize for not having read out my speech. There is no solidarity that does not have a core of self-interest in it. Be it because you believe in God and the reward will be heaven, that's self-interest. Or be it because you believe you show solidarity now with others and they will show solidarity with you when you need it. And this principle is challenged in our member states, has been challenged for a long time. The problem, in my view, resides in many member states in the middle classes who for the first time in a long, long time no longer are sure that their children will be better off than they are today. This is a paradigm change in many European societies. So if you believe that your children might be worse off, if you believe that the development of politics, of society, is a development that leads to loss for you, you will try and protect everything you have. And a call for solidarity on you will be interpreted by you as a further element of loss rather than an element of gain. If we don't get European society to move away from that position, a call for solidarity will be very hollow and will not be answered. If as politicians we don't understand that if we ask solidarity, it will only be given when people who give it understand that it's in their self-interest to show that solidarity. If we don't understand that concept, it will sound nice to ask for solidarity, but we will not get it. So the first responsibility in this crisis is to show to everyone around the European Union that, first of all, the refugee crisis can only be managed at a global and European level. Secondly, that if we are not able to manage it, it's not only Germany or Austria or Sweden or the Netherlands that will lose, it's all of us, because the ripple effect of not being able to manage it will affect all sorts of policy areas. And you've seen in the European Parliament already voices saying, if Central and Eastern European countries do not show solidarity, let's reconsider structural funds policies. You know, it's logical in human terms and political terms, but it's like saying, you know, if I don't get what that guy needs to give me, I'll shoot myself in the foot and see how he will suffer because I shoot myself in the foot. I mean, it's almost ridiculous, but it's a logical consequence of committing, because that's what it feels like. Decommitting from European solidarity will lead to decommitting on the other side of European solidarity, and that will lead us down the road we don't want to go. I believe in European cooperation, not because there's no alternative. There's an alternative to everything. I believe in European cooperation in this city of history because I have seen all the other forms during history that have been tried to help European peoples get along better. And with the exception of this one, all the other forms lead to war. So let's stick to this one. It works well. Let's modernize it. Let's make sure that our children and grandchildren can still profit from the same positive effects of European integration that we have seen over the last 25 years. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. I'm really glad that you did not underplay the dangers the European Union is facing. Just yesterday it was the Czech foreign minister who was giving us the example of Europeans walking like sleepwalkers towards the war in 1914.
Great book, by the way,
yes,
Sleepwalkers.
Christopher Clark.
Christopher Clark. Yeah.
But I'm even gladder or happier that you also pointed out that there are some ways out if the European Union stands united, and that you didn't shy away from talking about the relocation mechanism, which, as you well understand, and which was well demonstrated by our discussions yesterday, is a huge point of contention, especially in our Central European context. But as your schedule is very tight, we have a couple more minutes for at least one or two rounds of questions from the audience. So anyone who would like to ask a question. Mr. Hokowski here, there is another one, and there. Yeah, and then for the second round.
Thank you very much. Radko Hokowski from the European Value Think Tank, one of the co-organizers. You are speaking about solidarity with the refugees, solidarity among the member states, and also saying that we need to be tougher in order to protect the system. Two of the areas is protection of the external borders, yes, and return policy. Yes. And these are in the hands of the member states. Why do you think that these policies are not executed in the proper way? What are the obstacles in order to be tougher? And what do you think the member state needs to do in order to be more effective in these areas?
Mm-hmm. I think one of the mistakes that were made over the years is for member states to think they could deal with this on their own, because it turns out that in negotiating with third countries readmission agreements, individual member states doing this has not been very effective. So I think it is important that the European Union should take that responsibility and start talking in clear terms with third countries about them taking back their own nationals. And I see possibilities for that. I see, for instance, if you look at the numbers now in Turkey, you see the numbers of people coming from Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Afghanistan surging very quickly. I think these are three countries where it's perfectly possible to have good agreements on return policy of their nationals, with respect to those countries, with a schedule of return, even with perhaps some support in doing that. But it is quite clear that the message should be sent that asylum policy is not an easy way to look for a better economic future in the European Union. And we can only send that message clearly when people return to their villages in Pakistan and say to their brothers and sisters and to their wider friends in the village, oh my God, I spent $6,000-7,000 and I'm back here without having been able to go there. That will have a dissuading effect. These are things I think we need to do at the European level, and I honestly also believe we need to start talking a bit tougher with third countries about this, because we are no longer talking about something that is a nuisance. This is something that is profoundly affecting European societies in not only a positive way. And therefore I believe we are talking about our vital interests, and these vital interests can be represented better collectively when the European Union talks with third countries rather than just individual member states. And the second element, to be very honest with you and open with you, I think over the years return policy hasn't been very successful because once people would then told to leave, some would leave, some wouldn't leave, but those who wouldn't leave would simply disappear somewhere and okay, that was it. And so also there I believe we need to tighten our policies and make sure that return policies start working better.
Let us collect perhaps more questions at the same time because of the time constraints. Okay. There is one, then here, and then the two, and the Madam President.
Bruno Waterfield, Times. Can you tell us, after Valletta, how much closer you are to some readmission agreements with Africa? There's only Cape Verde at the moment. Is it not the case that the EU's rather high-handed intention to issue laissez-passer to people who have torn up their identity papers angered many African countries, and on that level, isn't the Valletta summit a failure?
I don't think so. I don't think it is a failure. It is another stepping stone towards creating a better structural situation. I know there are frustrations also on the African side because they're saying, hey, you're only talking about your refugees, look at the amount of refugees we have in our countries, and I fully accept that point and understand that point. But let's clarify it and let's continue talking with those countries on the basis of the fact that we're talking about their nationals. We're not talking about people who came to their countries as refugees. We're talking about their nationals. And we have, I think Niger is a nice example of where we can create a situation, even though the scale is still small, where it is in the mutual interest to have returns with some support to those people who return so that they can set up a business or get microcredit or do something else that would give them a start in their own society, which is also welcomed by the authorities of Niger. I know it's small, but it's a good place to start. And again, something that has been neglected for so many years, you don't fix that in a week or 2 weeks. It will take time to do that, but I think there is no alternative to really pushing for this. And in that sense, I absolutely don't see Valletta as a failure. On the contrary, I think it is another stepping stone on a path that will take some time to follow, but that is unavoidable for the European Union.
Thank you. The last three questions there, and Madam President.
Thank you very much. My name is Lucia Klapáčová from Slovakia, MESA 10 think tank. First, Mr. Timmermans, thank you very much, because I'm usually not thrilled with the speeches of the officials of the European Commission or other institutions, but I actually listen to you with the joy, because I think you really gave a good name to many things that we are going through right now. But still, I think that you were mostly talking about the consequences of something, but I would be interested as well to hear what you think about the reasons for getting there. Because I think that one thing is the solidarity inside of the European Union, but then where is the solidarity of actions outside of the European borders? Personally, I was working really a lot in the Western Balkans, in the Eastern Partnership countries, in the transfer of know-how from our EU and integration reforms. And not once I was seeing how European Union absolutely has not one policy toward those countries. Member states follow just their own selfish interests there. There is just, I was ashamed, really, to say, for many things that I saw happening there. And we don't even go to the Russia policy, to the Africa and all those kind of things. So I really think that this is also one of the most important cause of what is happening. We are just bearing the consequences of our act, where we are not acting based on our values outside of our borders, and not even speaking about development policy. Can you tell me a little bit maybe about this? Our Commission planning some changes in there, or what your personal view is on development on this area? Thank you.
I was wondering whether there was going to be a question in that statement, but there was at the end. What is Slovak for leading question? No, but I think there is. I mentioned in my introduction the fact that since 1990, the speed with which history has developed in political terms, in economic terms, and social terms is very difficult for many people to keep up with. And if I look at the country I know best, the Netherlands, and look at the reactions when Matteo Renzi earlier this week said Albania, and first he slapped Central Eastern Europe, and then he said Albania and Serbia should quickly become members of the European Union. In the Netherlands, there was sort of a sense of panic in the public debate. What? Even more members say, we can't. As the Germans would say, wir können das nicht verkraften. We can't digest that. And I think we have sometimes neglected. I think, again, the most wonderful thing I will have experienced when I die in my life is 2004, the enlargement of the European Union. So don't misunderstand me. I think this was, if you're a Cold War boy like myself, this was the high point in my professional life, without any doubt. We had to do it, and it was right that we did it. But neither here nor in the old member states have we had the time to digest this, and then again we go ask people to do more. That is, I think, more the problem with the issue of how we deal with this Balkan countries. No one, not even those who are Eurosceptical, no one would challenge the fact that the only structural solution for the Western Balkans is integration into the European Union. There is no alternative. Well, you know that. But it's about the pace and how you go about this that will determine whether we are successful. You know, we cannot endlessly rush ahead of public opinion. We should not cater to fear. We should not abuse public opinion. You should have the willingness to lead. But the willingness to lead should not lead to politicians running ahead and then at some point turning around and saying, hey, where are the people? So it's a subtle dynamic. It's a subtle dichotomy we're in here. And I would be less critical than you are about what we're doing in the Western Balkans. I see some encouraging developments, but I also see sometimes local politicians easily discarding themselves of their own responsibility and shoving that on the plate of the European Union, and that, to my mind, is equally unacceptable.
Thank you. And the last two brief questions, Madam Ambassador, Madam President, at the end.
Good morning, sir. I had a very sad personal pleasure to spend last 4.5 years in Baghdad as a head of European Union delegation. And I had this particularly sad pleasure to meet hundreds of people in refugee camps or transitory capacities, bringing Stylianides to Kirkuk and Kristalina close to Mosul. And one of the troubles I experience and am experiencing is that unfortunately current legal and financial European Union instruments are very far from being fit for purpose. If we speak about Madad Fund, if we speak about stabilization instrument, if we speak about DCI, they can very hardly be used, for instance, for so much needed education in these countries. My question therefore is there really any current strong thinking in European Commission how to immediately change the legal basis of these financial instruments and make them much more better fit for purpose, which is, for instance, education or healthcare, not speaking about development in Africa? And my second question related to education as well. How much are we currently doing inside Europe, in primary schools, to educate our own children to be able to cope and understand the migrants and migration crisis? Thank you very much.
Brief questions, you said. On your first question, you're absolutely right that the procedures we need to follow. You know, again, there's a lack of trust in how we manage our funds. So there's so much control and rules, etc. And this, you're talking about a situation I personally know less about. But now, in my present capacity, dealing with Turkey, dealing with what we need to do in the refugee camps surrounding Syria, I run into the same problem that, you know, we pledge, and then hopefully we actually give the money, which is not necessarily the case if we pledge in some member states. And then you have the money, and then the time that elapses between the moment you have the money and you can spend it is huge. And then frustration grows. So you are absolutely right. We need to look at that. We need to be able much more to... But then, you know, the other problem is when you're in an emergency, you spend quickly, and then you make mistakes, because that can happen if you spend very quickly in an emergency. You then afterwards get slammed terribly by the Court of Auditors and others. So also the people working in the Commission are extremely reluctant to take risks because they are afraid that the repercussions will be great. So I accept your point that we need to fix this, but this is not going to be fixed overnight, I'm afraid. Education. All what we're talking about comes back to a common understanding of what we have in common. And a common understanding of what we have in common is only created through education, at home and in schools. So, you know, citizens are made at home and in schools. And this is not about telling people to be good Europeans, etc. Nonsense. It's about giving people the tools to function in a society in a constructive and positive way. And that should be part and parcel of any educational system, since, you know, it's no longer in societies that will become more diverse. The common understanding in a society is no longer as broad as in societies that are not diverse. And let me say, in this city, societies will be more diverse. It's a global development. And those leaders in some Central European countries who portray the end of their civilization because 1 or 2% of the population might not be of the same religion, they are fighting against the current of history. They are fighting against the current of history. The Czech Republic will be a more diverse place. This is not because Brussels wants it, because I had an interesting exchange with Prime Minister Orbán when I said societies will be more diverse. Here again, a commissioner from Brussels telling us that we should take... No. Even if we do nothing, even if there is no European Union, global developments are such that people will be moving around in the world. And every society tomorrow will be more diverse than today. I would say embrace it. It's a great gift.
Thank you very much. I've just received to know that unfortunately Mr. Vice President has to leave now. So please join me in thanking him for the keynote speech as well as the answers.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks a lot.